Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Tonight, we do not begin with a body in a locked room. We do not begin with a poisoned teacup or a dagger hidden behind a velvet curtain. Tonight, we begin with something far more ordinary. A card game. A simple game of poker played by 4 gentlemen in a private club in London. The year is 1952. The room smells of tobacco and aged whiskey. The light is low, the stakes are high, and somewhere in that carefully shuffled deck of 52 cards, death is waiting, patient and precise, for exactly the right moment. One man will reach for a card, one specific card, and he will never let it go. The King of Diamonds. Now, you might ask, how does a killer predict which card a man will pick? How does one plan a murder around luck, around chance, around the unpredictable hand of fate? These are not simple questions. But then again, nothing is simple when Monsieur Hercule Poirot is in the room. He will notice what others do not. He will ask questions that seem foolish until they are not. He will make an assumption or two that leads him slightly astray. He is, after all, only human, but his little grey cells, those are something else entirely. So pull up a chair. The cards are dealt, the game has already begun, and someone at this table is a murderer, the gentleman's game. The Craven Club occupied the 3rd floor of a narrow Georgian building on St. James's Street, sandwiched between a tailor of some reputation and a wine merchant of considerably less. It was not the most fashionable of London's private clubs. That distinction belonged to others whose names appeared more regularly in the society pages. But it had a certain quality that its members valued above fashion, above prestige, and very nearly above comfort. It had discretion. No names were spoken loudly within its walls. No business dealings were discussed near open windows. The staff were paid generously and trained thoroughly, and if they occasionally witnessed things that might have interested the editors of certain newspapers, they had the good sense and the good salary to remember nothing. It was, in short, the perfect place for a private poker game. The game had been arranged 3 weeks in advance, which was itself something of a rarity. Usually, the Thursday evening card sessions at the Craven were informal affairs, 4 or 5 members drifting in after supper, loosening their ties, calling for brandy, and settling into whatever entertainment the evening offered. But this particular Thursday in November of 1952 was different. This one had been planned. Invitations, if one could call them that, had been extended, and the 4 men who gathered around the green baize table at 9:30 had each accepted with the kind of studied casualness that suggested they very much wanted to be there. The table itself was positioned in the smaller of the club's 2 card rooms, separated from the main lounge by a set of panelled doors that were this evening firmly shut. A single chandelier burned overhead, though 2 of its bulbs had apparently given up sometime in the previous week and had not yet been replaced. The light was adequate. Just. The first to arrive had been Mr. Gerald Fothergill, 53 years old, florid of complexion, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes not from intelligence, but from having never, in 5 decades of living, been seriously contradicted. He was a property man, or had been, before a series of quietly disastrous investments had begun to erode the foundation of his fortune in ways that his tailor had not yet noticed, but that his banker certainly had. He wore a signet ring on his right hand, and had the habit of turning it when he was nervous, at which was more often than he would have admitted. He had poured himself a whiskey before the others arrived, and was on his second by the time the next man came through the door. Mr. Raymond Ashby entered with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to keeping appointments. He was younger than Fothergill by nearly 15 years, 38, lean, with dark hair going silver at the temples in a way that looked almost deliberate. He worked in insurance, which is to say that he spent his professional life calculating the precise odds of disaster and charging people accordingly. He was very good at his job. He shook Fothergill's hand with 2 firm pumps and declined the offer of a drink, requesting instead a glass of water, which Fothergill found faintly offensive. The third man arrived 6 minutes late, which he acknowledged with a brief, unapologetic nod. Mr. Victor Ashworth was 61, grey-haired, and carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had once been very important and was determined that no one should forget it. He had spent 20 years in the Foreign Office, retiring under circumstances that were described publicly as voluntary and privately as something rather more complicated. He wore his age well, straight-backed, clear-eyed, though those who looked closely might have noticed something beneath the composure. A tightness around the jaw, a quality of watchfulness that had not entirely relaxed since his years abroad. He ordered brandy, settled into his chair, and said very little for the first quarter of an hour. The fourth and final player was Mr. Dennis Harlow, 45, broad-shouldered, with the kind of open, agreeable face that made people instinctively trust him before they had any particular reason to. He had made his money in imports, or so he said, and said it in the easy, unremarkable way of a man who had said it many times and never been pressed further. He laughed readily, tipped generously, and had the dealer's habit of shuffling cards without looking at his hands. He was also, though none of the others knew it, deeply in debt to Victor Ashworth. The game began at 9:45. The rules had been agreed in advance. 5-card draw, table stakes, no wild cards. A gentleman's game, Fothergill had called it when the arrangement was made, which was the sort of thing people said when they meant the stakes were high enough to matter. For the first hour, nothing of particular consequence occurred. Fothergill won 2 moderate hands and lost a larger one. Ashby played with the methodical precision of someone who had, one suspected, read several books on the subject of probability. Harlow was sociable and loose, folding often but making the losses seem deliberate, like a man conserving his energy. Ashworth played quietly and won more than he lost, which nobody commented on. The conversation moved through the usual channels, a word about the weather, which had been unreasonably cold for November, some brief and carefully non-committal remarks about a recent parliamentary vote, the relative merits of 2 racehorses, one of which Fothergill had apparently lost money on. At some point before 11, a 5th person entered the room. He came in not through the panelled doors from the main lounge, but through the smaller service entrance at the rear, a door that the club used for bringing in refreshments discreetly. He was a small man, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, with a remarkable moustache that occupied a significant portion of his upper face. He carried a cup of tisane, which he had apparently negotiated from the kitchen staff, and he settled himself into an armchair near the window with the air of a man who had been expected. He had not, strictly speaking, been expected. But Hercule Poirot had a long-standing acquaintance with one of the club's senior members, a retired judge who had assured him with great confidence that the card room on Thursday evenings was always empty and would make a perfectly adequate place for Poirot to sit quietly and read, which was all he wanted to do. The judge had been wrong, as it turned out, but by the time Poirot discovered this, he had already settled into the armchair, and the tisane was already in his hand, and it seemed unnecessarily disruptive to leave. So he stayed. He did not play. He was not invited to, and he did not ask. He sat with his small book, a French novel he had been meaning to finish for 3 months, and he read, or appeared to read, while the 4 men at the table played their game. He noticed things, as he always did, because he could not help it. It was the particular misfortune, or fortune depending on one's perspective, of a mind like his that it registered details automatically, without effort or intention, the way an ear registers sound. He noticed that Fothergill's signet ring had been turned 11 times in the past 40 minutes. He noticed that Ashby never looked at his cards immediately upon receiving them, but always waited 3 or 4 seconds first. He noticed that Harlow's easy laughter had a very slight pause before it, a fraction of a second in which something else crossed his face before the smile arrived. And he noticed that Victor Ashworth, for all his composure, had not once looked directly at Dennis Harlow since sitting down. Poirot turned a page of his novel and sipped his tisane. The night, he thought, had a particular quality to it, the kind of stillness that precedes something. He was not yet sure what. The dead man's hand. The clock on the mantelpiece read 11:47 when Victor Ashworth won the largest pot of the evening. It was not a dramatic hand, not the kind that gets retold afterwards with embellishment and gesture. He had simply played it correctly, which is to say that he had said very little, bet moderately, and allowed the other men to convince themselves that he was bluffing. Fothergill had pushed too hard on a pair of kings. Ashby had folded early, which was sensible. Harlow had stayed in longer than he should have, which was interesting. Ashworth drew the winnings toward himself with both hands, unhurried, methodical, and stacked the notes with the precision of a man who had once counted things for a living. "Another hand?" Fothergill asked. His voice carried the particular brightness of a man who has been losing and is determined not to show it. "One more," Ashworth said. "Then I think I shall call it an evening." Harlow was already shuffling. He did it well, the cards moving through his fingers in smooth, practiced arcs. And there was something almost hypnotic about it. The way the deck collapsed and reformed, each shuffle theoretically randomizing what had come before. He cut the deck twice, offered it to Fothergill for a third cut, and then began to deal. From his armchair, Poirot watched. He had long since abandoned any pretense of reading. The novel lay closed on his knee, one finger marking a page he had no intention of returning to. He was watching the table with the expression he sometimes wore when something was not quite right, not wrong enough to name, not clear enough to act upon, but present, like a smell one cannot locate. The cards went around, 5 to each man, face down, dealt with Harlow's usual efficiency. Fothergill picked his up immediately, fanning them with the enthusiasm of a man who has not yet learned that enthusiasm at a card table is a form of confession. His expression gave nothing away. He had that much discipline at least, but his right hand moved to his signet ring and turned it once, twice. Ashby waited his customary 3 seconds, then looked. Whatever he saw, he received it with the same mild accountant's expression he had maintained all evening. Harlow glanced at his cards briefly and set them face down again, was reaching instead for his glass of whiskey. And Victor Ashworth picked up his hand. He looked at the cards for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he set 4 of them down on the table, keeping only one, and that one he held between the thumb and forefinger of his right hand, raised slightly, as a man holds something he is examining in better light. It was the King of Diamonds. Poirot noticed this. He noticed it with the same automatic precision with which he noticed everything, and he filed it away without yet knowing why it mattered. "I'll take 4, Ashworth said. Harlow dealt him 4 new cards from the top of the deck. Ashworth added them to the King of Diamonds, arranged his hand, and considered it for a moment. Then something happened. It began, as these things sometimes do, with very little warning. Ashworth set his cards down on the table, carefully, which struck Poirot later as significant, the carefulness of it, and brought his right hand up to his collar. It was a small gesture, the kind a man makes when his tie is too tight, or when the room is warmer than he expected. Then his left hand joined it. Then he made a sound, not a word, not quite, a short compressed exhalation, like a man who has been struck somewhere he did not anticipate. Fothergill looked up from his cards. "Ashworth? You all right, old man?" Ashworth did not answer. His face, which had been its usual careful grey, had shifted, not dramatically, not in the manner of theatrical collapse, but in the way of a man whose body is making a decision that his mind has not yet been consulted about. A slight slackening around the jaw, a glassiness behind the eyes, and he slid from his chair in stages, first a list to the left, then a hand reaching for the table edge, finding it, losing it, and by the time Fothergill had pushed back his own chair and come around the table, Ashworth was on the floor. He was not unconscious, not entirely. His eyes were open, and he was breathing short, shallow breaths that seemed to cost him considerable effort. And for a moment, perhaps 10 seconds, he looked directly at the ceiling with an expression that was almost peaceful, almost puzzled, as though he had just been told something surprising and was deciding how to respond. Then his eyes closed. Then he stopped breathing. What followed was the particular chaos of men who are not accustomed to chaos. Fothergill called for help, loudly, twice, his voice cracking on the second attempt. Ashby was already at Ashworth's side, 2 fingers pressed to the man's neck, his insurance man's face arranged into an expression of careful assessment that did not quite conceal the shock beneath it. Harlow stood back, one hand still holding his whiskey glass, the other pressed flat against the card table, and said nothing at all. The club's night steward appeared within 2 minutes, took one look at the situation, and went immediately to telephone for an ambulance and the police, in that order, which suggested he had some previous experience with emergencies and had thought carefully about priorities. Poirot set down his tisane, placed his novel on the side table, and rose from his armchair. He did not rush. There was nothing to rush toward. It was already clear, in the way these things sometimes are, and that Victor Ashworth was beyond the assistance of an ambulance. But he walked to the table, and he stood there, looking, which was what he did when there was something to look at. The cards were still on the table, each man's hand, more or less where they had left it. Ashworth's 4 new cards were fanned slightly to the left. And there, separate from the others, still where Ashworth had set it down in those last careful seconds, the King of Diamonds. Poirot looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then he looked at the 3 remaining men. Fothergill, who had crouched beside Ashworth and was now straightening up with the expression of a man who does not know what to do with his hands. Ashby, who was still kneeling, still methodical, checking pulse and breath with the thoroughness of someone who already knows the answer. Harlow, who had finally set down his whiskey glass and was looking at the card table rather than at Ashworth, which was, Poirot thought, an interesting choice. "Gentlemen," Poirot said quietly. They looked at him. It was not clear any of them had registered his presence before this moment. "I think," he said, "that it would be best if no one touches anything." Inspector Graves arrived at 12:34. He was a tall man, unhurried in his movements, with the slightly disappointed expression of someone who had been hoping for a quiet night and had learned, over many years of policing, not to expect one. He knew Poirot by reputation. Most of Scotland Yard did, in one way or another, and he accepted his presence in the room with the weary pragmatism of a man who has learned that arguing with Poirot is possible but rarely productive. "Oh, natural causes?" Graves asked, looking down at Ashworth. "That," Poirot said, "is what we must determine. Heart, most likely. Man 61, overweight." "He was not overweight," Poirot said mildly. "He was perhaps 10 pounds heavier than ideal. There is a distinction." Graves looked at him. "You knew him? I had not met him before this evening. However, I observed him for approximately 2 hours, and I can tell you that his colour was good, his breathing was regular, and he showed none of the particular signs of cardiac distress that one associates with a man in poor health. He was, to all appearances, a man in reasonable condition for his age. Men in reasonable condition have heart attacks." "They do," Poirot agreed, "and yet—" He said nothing further. He simply gestured very slightly toward the card table. Graves looked. He looked at the scattered hands, the chips, the glasses, the ashtray with its 2 half-finished cigarettes. He looked for a moment without seeing. Then, the cards? "The card," Poirot corrected. "Specifically, that one." The King of Diamonds lay where Ashworth had placed it, face up, slightly apart from the others, as though it had been deliberately separated, which, in a sense, it had. Graves crouched down, bringing his face level with the table. He looked at the card for a long moment. Then he produced a pen from his breast pocket and used the end of it, carefully, without touching the card's surface, to tilt it slightly toward the light. He saw it. On the upper right corner of the card, almost invisible against the printed border, was a mark. Tiny, precise, and the kind of mark that a pin makes when pressed with deliberate care into a surface. Graves straightened up slowly. "Well," he said. "Yes," said Poirot. There was a pause. "Contact poison," Poirot said, in the same quiet, almost conversational tone he might have used to remark on the weather. "Applied to the surface of the card, or perhaps beneath it. The precise method will require analysis. Fast-acting, clearly, and targeted." He paused. Someone knew which card Monsieur Ashworth would pick up. Graves stared at him. "That's impossible. It's a shuffled deck." "And yet," Poirot said again, with the same gentle, infuriating patience, "here we are." He looked once more at the King of Diamonds. "The question, mon ami, is not whether it is possible. The question is how. And once we understand how—" He touched the tips of his fingers together, lightly. "We will understand who." The ambulance took Ashworth at 1:15. The 3 remaining players were asked to stay, a request that was phrased politely and meant absolutely. And they sat in the main lounge with cups of tea that nobody drank, saying very little. Harlow had gone pale somewhere between the ambulance arriving and the tea being poured, and he sat with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes fixed on a painting of a Scottish landscape that hung above the fireplace. Fothergill talked. He did what people of his temperament always do in moments of crisis. He filled the silence, covering it over with words the way one covers a stain with a rug, hoping the surface impression will serve. He spoke about shock, about poor Ashworth, about the last time a man had collapsed at his club. A different club many years ago, different circumstances entirely. Ashby said almost nothing. He sat very straight, his water glass still half full, he had not touched it since the game began, on the table in front of him, and he looked at Poirot occasionally with an expression that was difficult to read. Poirot, for his part, sat in a corner chair and was very still. He was thinking about probability, about shuffled cards and predictable men, about the particular way that Harlow had dealt, so smooth, so practiced, and about the 4 seconds in which Victor Ashworth had held the King of Diamonds up to the light before the game had even properly begun. He was also thinking about a mistake he had just made. He had told Graves, with some confidence, and with the assurance of a man who trusts his instincts, that Ashworth had shown no signs of cardiac distress, no signs of poor health. A man in reasonable condition. He had been thinking, while he said it, of Ashworth's colour and posture and breathing. He had not been thinking of the man's hands, which had trembled just slightly twice during the first hour of the game. Poirot had noticed it at the time and had categorized it without much thought as nerves. It might have been nerves. It might also have been something else entirely. He filed this away, the uncertainty of it, the slight embarrassment of having spoken with more confidence than the evidence strictly warranted, and returned to the problem at hand. Someone at this table had known that Victor Ashworth would pick up the King of Diamonds, and the question was not whether that was possible. The question was how anyone could know such a thing with enough certainty to stake a murder on it. The little grey cells awaken. The laboratory report arrived on Friday morning. Poirot was at breakfast when Graves telephoned, a meal he took seriously, with proper coffee and 2 soft-boiled eggs timed to exactly 4 minutes, a routine he had maintained for so many years that any deviation from it put him in a mood that lasted until lunch. He listened to Graves with one hand holding the receiver and the other resting on the table beside his coffee cup, quite still. Aconitine, Graves said, derived from monkshood. The toxicologist says it acts within minutes, sometimes faster, depending on the concentration and the point of contact. Absorbed through the skin. A pause. The card was treated on the reverse side. Very precise application. A small area, upper right corner, are consistent with where a man might hold a card between thumb and forefinger. The upper right corner, Poirot repeated. Exactly where your pinprick was. Yes. Poirot was quiet for a moment. And the pinprick itself. Likely to ensure the poison penetrated the card's coating. The surface of a playing card is treated, lacquered, essentially. A direct application might not absorb adequately. The puncture allowed the compound to be introduced more deeply into the material. Precise, Poirot said, very. This was not improvised, Inspector. This required preparation, knowledge of chemistry, or access to someone who possessed it, and considerable patience. I know, Graves said. He sounded, Poirot thought, like a man who had been hoping the answer would be simpler. We're treating it as murder. Formally, as of this morning. Naturellement, Poirot said, and returned to his eggs. He arrived at Scotland Yard at 10:30, which was not strictly necessary. Graves had not asked him to come, and Poirot had no official standing in the matter. But Graves had also not told him not to come, which Poirot interpreted with some justification as an invitation. The files on the 4 players had been assembled with reasonable efficiency. Poirot sat across from Graves and read them in the order they were handed to him, which was alphabetical, which was not the order he would have chosen, but which he accepted without comment. He read. He turned pages. He occasionally made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite nothing, that caused Graves to look up from his own papers and wait, and then look down again when nothing further was offered. After 40 minutes, Poirot set the files on the desk and pressed his fingertips together. Fothergill, he said, his financial difficulties are more serious than his manner suggests. 3 failed property ventures in the past 4 years. A loan taken 18 months ago from a private creditor. He paused. The creditor is not named in this file. We're working on it. Work faster, Poirot said pleasantly. Ashby, the insurance man. He and Ashworth were acquainted professionally. Ashworth held a life policy through Ashby's firm, a substantial one. Graves nodded. We noticed that. The beneficiary? Ashworth's sister. She lives in Edinburgh. We've spoken to her. She's 73 in poor health and appears to have had no contact with her brother in several years. Poirot did not dismiss this, but he set it aside. And Harlow. Dennis Harlow. Graves leaned back in his chair. Import business, as he says. Legitimate on the surface. However, he opened a separate folder. There are some questions about certain shipments from the continent, nothing proven. He's been looked at twice in the past 3 years, and nothing has stuck. He is a careful man, Poirot said, or a lucky one. In my experience, Poirot said, men who are looked at twice and never charged are rarely merely lucky. He was quiet then for a moment, looking at the middle distance with the expression that those who knew him recognized as the outward sign of inward machinery. The debt, he said. Harlow owed money to Ashworth. You confirmed this? £12,000, Graves said. Borrowed 2 years ago. No formal agreement. Nothing on paper. Ashworth's personal accounts show a withdrawal. Harlow's show a corresponding deposit. We only found it this morning. £12,000. Poirot considered this figure with the attention it deserved. It was not a small amount. It was, in fact, the kind of amount that could make a man desperate. Or, alternatively, the kind of amount that a dead creditor could no longer collect. Then Harlow is our man, Graves said, with the satisfied tone of someone who has completed a puzzle. Poirot looked at him. You think so, he said. Motive is clear. Eliminate the debt by eliminating the man he owes it to. He dealt the cards. He had the opportunity to prepare the deck in advance. He's the only one at that table with direct physical access to… Inspector. Poirot held up one small hand. You are doing what I myself was in danger of doing this morning, and I must warn you against it. Graves stopped. You are allowing the clearest answer to become the only answer, Poirot said. Harlow is obvious. He dealt the cards, yes. He had motive, yes. But consider, a man who has been investigated twice and never charged is a man who understands that obvious is dangerous. Would such a man arrange a murder in a room where he is the dealer? Where the connection between himself and the victim is a debt of £12,000? Graves was quiet. Perhaps, Poirot continued, perhaps he would, if he was desperate enough or arrogant enough. These things happen, but we must not decide it before we have looked properly. He paused. I speak from some personal embarrassment on this matter. Graves raised an eyebrow. Last night, Poirot said, with the slight discomfort of a man admitting something he would rather not. I told you that Ashworth showed no signs of poor health. I said it with confidence. I should not have. You were wrong. I was incomplete. I had noticed during the evening that Ashworth's hands trembled on 2 occasions. I had categorized this as anxiety and moved on. I did not consider it medically significant at the time. He straightened slightly. The toxicologist's report confirms that aconitine, even before it acts fatally, can produce tremor in the extremities. What I observed may have been the poison beginning its work earlier than I realized. Meaning he was already in contact with the poison before he picked up the King of Diamonds, possibly. Or meaning his hands trembled for another reason entirely. And I am now constructing a narrative to fit a fact I cannot explain. This is the danger, Inspector, of deciding too quickly. He met Graves's eyes. "I do not know, and I think it is important that I say so." Graves looked at him for a moment with an expression that might have been surprise. "Right," he said. "So, what do we know?" Poirot settled back. "We know that the card was prepared in advance. This required time, materials, and knowledge. We know that the killer predicted, with sufficient certainty to stake a human life upon it, that Ashworth would pick up the King of Diamonds. This is the central problem. Not who, not yet, but how." He pressed his fingertips together. "How does one know which card a man will choose?" "You can't," Graves said. "Not from a shuffled deck." "And yet the deck was not simply shuffled," Poirot said. "It was shuffled by Harlow, who is, as I observed last night, and as I suspect you will find if you make inquiries, a man of considerable skill with cards." He let this sit. "A skilled card handler," he continued slowly, "can do things with a deck that appear to be chance but are not. A false shuffle, one that appears to randomize the cards but does not, or does so only partially. A controlled deal in which specific cards are directed to specific positions." He paused. "I am not saying this is what occurred. I am saying it is possible. And I am saying that a man who can deal a specific card to a specific position at a specific moment has solved what appeared to be the impossible problem at the center of this murder." Graves was very still. But that still requires knowing which card Ashworth would keep," he said. "Yes," Poirot said. "It does." He was quiet for a moment. "And that, I think, is where we must look next. Not at the cards, not at the poison, at the man himself, at Victor Ashworth, and at why, of all the cards in a deck, the King of Diamonds was the one he could be relied upon to hold." He stood straightening his jacket with the small, precise movements of a man who takes such things seriously. "There is something in Ashworth's past," he said, "something that made him predictable. And someone at that table knew what it was. 4 players, 4 secrets. The rain began on Friday afternoon and did not stop. It came down in the particular way of November rain in London, not dramatically, not in sheets or storms, but steadily, patiently, as though it had made a commitment and intended to honor it. The streets of St. James's darkened. The pavements grew slick. The few pedestrians who had ventured out moved quickly, heads down, collars up, with the defeated posture of people who had checked the forecast and chosen to disbelieve it. Poirot stood at the window of his flat in Whitehaven Mansions and watched the rain for approximately 3 minutes. Then he turned back to his sitting room, where 4 separate folders were arranged on his desk, with the precision of a man who believes that the organization of physical objects assists the organization of thought. He had asked for the afternoon, not from Graves. Graves had his own inquiries to conduct, but from the problem itself. He needed to think, and he thought best alone, with coffee, without interruption, in a room where everything was exactly where it ought to be. He opened the first folder. Gerald Fothergill had been born in Shropshire in 1899, the second son of a solicitor whose practice was respectable without being remarkable. He had attended a minor public school, served adequately in the First War, and emerged in 1919 with a small inheritance, a moderate taste for gambling, and the unshakable conviction, common to a certain type of Englishman, that prosperity was his natural condition, and that the details of achieving it would sort themselves out. For a time, they had. He had married well, a woman of some family and some money, who had died in 1944, leaving him the house in Wiltshire, and a trust that he had since managed with impressive consistency to diminish. 2 children, both grown, both living at what Poirot suspected was a carefully maintained distance from their father's financial enthusiasms. The property ventures had begun in 1948. 3 of them in 4 years, each entered with confidence and exited with loss. The pattern was not unusual. Poirot had seen it many times. But what interested him was not the losses themselves, but the loans that had preceded them. Fothergill, it appeared. He had a habit of borrowing against expectations rather than assets. A man who lives perpetually in the future tense, always one deal away from the restoration of his fortunes. The unnamed creditor, the one Graves was still working to identify, had provided £3,500 18 months ago. A private arrangement, no formal documentation. This was the kind of loan that came with conditions that were never written down, and were therefore, in a certain sense, more binding than anything a solicitor might draft. Poirot turned a page and found a detail that Graves had underlined in pencil. Fothergill had served briefly, in the late 1930s, on the board of a small chemical company, dissolved in 1941. The company had manufactured, among other things, agricultural compounds, pesticides, herbicides, and certain related substances whose commercial applications were legitimate and whose other potential applications required a degree of imagination that not everyone possessed. Poirot looked at this for a long moment. Aconitine was not a pesticide, but a man who had spent 3 years adjacent to industrial chemistry, who had attended board meetings, who had perhaps listened more carefully than the other directors, who had the particular attentiveness of someone always looking for advantage, might have acquired knowledge that a purely commercial man would not have. He made a note. He did not underline it. He simply wrote it down and moved to the next folder. Raymond Ashby was, on paper, the least interesting of the 4 men. 38 years old, born in Surrey, educated at a grammar school, then at the University of London, and where he had studied mathematics with enough distinction to attract the attention of 2 separate firms before he had even graduated. He had joined Consolidated Maritime Insurance in 1937, risen steadily, and was now, at an age when many of his contemporaries were still climbing, a senior underwriter with responsibility for a portfolio that ran to several £1 million annually. He was unmarried. He lived in Kensington in a flat that Graves's sergeant had described in the notes as orderly. He had no criminal record, no documented financial difficulties, no obvious vices. He attended church on alternate Sundays, which struck Poirot as either admirably moderate or suspiciously precise, depending on how one chose to look at it. The connection to Ashworth was the life policy. Poirot read through the details carefully, and the policy had been taken out 4 years ago. Ashworth approaching Ashby's firm directly, which was not unusual. Consolidated Maritime was well regarded. The sum assured was £15,000, with the sister in Edinburgh as sole beneficiary. Ashby had handled the account personally, which was perhaps slightly unusual for a man of his seniority, but not remarkably so. What was slightly more unusual was this. Ashby had visited Ashworth's home on 3 occasions in the past 18 months, each time listed in the firm's records as a client review meeting. Poirot knew enough about the insurance business to know that client review meetings were not, as a rule, conducted in person at a private residence 3 times in a year and a half. He did not know what these meetings had been about. He wrote this down. Then he wrote, beneath it, what did Ashworth know about Ashby? He looked at this question for a moment. Then he added beneath that, or What did Ashby know about Ashworth? He was not yet certain which direction the knowledge flowed, but he was certain it flowed somewhere. Dennis Harlow required more time. This was partly because there was more material. Graves had been thorough, and the file ran to 11 pages, and partly because the material had a quality that Poirot found more interesting than the straightforward facts it contained. It was the quality of a life that had been carefully constructed. Not falsified, exactly, not fabricated, but arranged, selected, presented. The import business was real. Harlow Trading had operated since 1946, importing textile goods and certain foodstuffs from Belgium, the Netherlands, and occasionally Portugal. Its accounts were filed regularly and showed a modest but consistent profit. Its premises in Bermondsey were occupied, its staff were paid, its invoices were genuine. And yet, Graves's notes referenced two separate investigations, 1949 and 1951, in which Harlow's firm had come to the attention of Customs and Excise in connection with shipments whose declared contents had not, on close inspection, perfectly matched their actual contents. On both occasions, the discrepancy had been attributed to clerical error. On both occasions, Harlow himself had been cooperative, apologetic, and impossible to charge. Clerical error twice. Poirot had a considerable respect for coincidence as a statistical phenomenon. He had somewhat less respect for it as an explanation. The debt to Ashworth, £12,000, 2 years ago, appeared in this context as something more complex than a simple loan between acquaintances. Harlow's firm had experienced a difficult period in late 1950. A shipment held up, a contract that had fallen through, a cash flow problem of the kind that could be managed but not easily. Ashworth had provided the money. No paperwork, no interest terms, no repayment schedule documented anywhere, which meant the terms had been agreed some other way, and which meant that Ashworth, in holding that debt, had held something else as well, something less tangible but perhaps more valuable. The knowledge of why Harlow had needed the money so urgently, and from where and from what it was meant to come. A man with that knowledge had considerable power over Dennis Harlow. A dead man had none. Poirot sat for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he turned to the fourth folder. Victor Ashworth was the victim. Poirot reminded himself of this regularly when reading the file, because the material had a way of pulling him in other directions. The Foreign Office career spanned 1921 to 1943. Postings in 3 countries, Poirot noted them: Vienna, Cairo, and a third whose name was redacted in the file, replaced with a small black rectangle that told him nothing except that someone had decided he should not know it. He made a note to ask Graves about this, though he suspected the answer would be unsatisfying. The retirement in 1943 was, as the rumors had suggested, not entirely voluntary. The file did not say this directly. Government files rarely did. But the language used was the particular kind of careful, administrative language that means something quite specific to anyone who knows how to read it. Retired at his own request following a period of extended leave. Which meant, translated, asked to leave given the opportunity to frame it otherwise, and wise enough to take it. Why, the file did not say. The redacted posting, Poirot suspected, was where the answer lived. What the file did say was that Ashworth had, since his retirement, lived quietly. A flat in Mayfair, some involvement with 2 or 3 private companies as a non-executive director, the kind of directorship that requires a name on the letterhead, and an occasional afternoon in a boardroom, and not much else. A membership at the Craven Club, maintained for 11 years. And one other thing. Poirot found it near the end of the file, but in a section of personal history that Graves had assembled from interviews with people who had known Ashworth. A former colleague from the Foreign Office, now retired to Dorset, who had been tracked down and spoken to on Friday morning. The colleague had mentioned, in passing, almost as an afterthought, that Ashworth had been a card player for most of his adult life. Not a gambler precisely, he had never been reckless with money, but a devoted and serious student of card games, poker, bridge, écarté. He had played in Vienna, in Cairo, in whatever the redacted city was. He had, the colleague said, certain habits at the table that were well known to anyone who had played with him regularly. The colleague had laughed, remembering. Old Victor always kept his picture cards, he had said, kings, queens, or knaves. Didn't matter what else he had in his hand. He'd always find a way to hold on to the face cards if he could. Said it was habit. Said he'd learned early that the court cards changed hands more than people expected, and he liked to know where they were. Poirot read this twice. Then he set the folder down, and was still for rather a long time. There it was. Not a coincidence, not chance, not luck, a habit. A known, documented, long-standing habit that anyone who had played cards with the Victor Ashworth more than once would have observed. And anyone who had played with him several times would have come to rely upon as a near certainty. Ashworth held his picture cards. And if you knew that, if you had played with him before, or spoken to someone who had, then the problem of predicting which card he would keep was not a problem at all. You dealt him a hand in which the only picture card was the King of Diamonds. He would keep it automatically, as he always did, as he had always done. The other 4 cards he might exchange, might rearrange, might deliberate over. But the King of Diamonds he would hold, between the thumb and forefinger of his right hand, upper right corner, where the poison was. Poirot pressed his fingertips together very slowly, joint by joint, until his hands formed a neat arch in front of his face. The how was now clear. The deck had been arranged, or partially arranged, so that the King of Diamonds would reach Ashworth's hand. Harlow, dealing with his practiced efficiency, had ensured it. The false shuffle, the one that appeared to randomize the deck but had not, or not entirely, had kept the King of Diamonds in a position from which it could be directed. 5-card draw, 5 cards dealt to 4 players. 20 cards from the top of the deck. With skill, with the kind of skill that comes from long practice, a man who knew what he was doing could place a specific card in a specific position. And Ashworth, reliable as clockwork, had picked it up and held it exactly where the killer had known he would. The murder had required 3 things. It had required knowledge of Ashworth's habits at the card table. It had required access to aconitine and the knowledge of how to apply it. It had required the ability to manipulate a deck of cards without detection. Poirot stood, walked to his window, and looked out at the rain. 3 requirements, 4 men. Harlow could deal, that was established. But could he obtain aconitine? Did he know Ashworth's card-playing habits well enough? Had he played with him before? The file said nothing about previous meetings between the 2 men before the debt arrangement. Fothergill had the chemical background. Peripheral, yes, a board membership, not a laboratory career, but sufficient perhaps. And he had played at the Craven Club for years. He might well have played with Ashworth before, but could he deal as Harlow dealt? Ashby knew Ashworth through the insurance policy, had visited him 3 times, had opportunity for close observation, was a mathematician by training. the kind of mind that understood probability, that could work out exactly what needed to happen and in what order. But cards, card handling, nothing in the file suggested it. And then there was the question that had been sitting at the back of Poirot's mind since the previous evening, quiet and patient, waiting for him to be ready to address it. Could two of these men have done it together? He turned from the window. One man to prepare the card, one man to deal it. He thought about the 3 visits Ashby had made to Ashworth's home. He thought about the unnamed creditor who had lent Fothergill £3,500. He thought about Harlow's 2 investigations that had produced nothing, and the silent, careful way Harlow had stood with his whiskey glass while Ashworth died on the floor. He thought about the small black rectangle in the file where a city's name should have been. And he thought, this was new. This had not occurred to him until this moment, when he felt the familiar small lift of the grey cells engaging. He thought about who had arranged the game. He had assumed the game was Fothergill's doing, because Fothergill was the sort of man who arranged things and talked about them afterwards. But he had not actually verified this. Who had suggested this particular game on this particular evening with these particular 4 men? He picked up the telephone and called Graves. "Inspector," he said when the call connected, "I have one question. When you spoke to the 3 men last night, who arranged the poker game? Whose idea was it originally?" There was a pause on the other end, papers being consulted. "Harlow," Graves said. "According to all 3 of them, it was Harlow who suggested it about 3 weeks ago." "And who suggested the players?" Another pause. "Harlow," Graves said again, more slowly this time. "Merci," Poirot said, and replaced the receiver. He stood in the center of his sitting room, 4 folders on the desk behind him, rain against the window in front, and he considered what he now knew and what he still did not know, and the distance between those 2 things. It was smaller than it had been this morning, but it was not yet small enough. The mathematics of murder. Saturday arrived grey and cold. Poirot did not sleep well. This was not unusual when a case had reached the particular stage this one had reached. The stage where enough was known to be uncomfortable, but not enough to be certain. He lay awake for some time in the small hours, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom with the expression of a man having a disagreement with himself, and rose at 6:15 feeling neither rested nor unrested, but simply ready, which was perhaps the best one could hope for. He made his coffee with care. He ate his eggs. He read the morning paper without absorbing much of it because his mind was elsewhere, turning things over, examining them, setting them down, picking them up again. By 8 o'clock he was at his desk. He had, during the night, arrived at something. Not a conclusion. He was too careful for that, too conscious of his earlier error with Ashworth's trembling hands, but a direction. A line of reasoning that, if followed with sufficient patience, might lead somewhere definitive. It began with probability. Poirot was not, by training or inclination, a mathematician. He respected mathematics the way one respects a foreign language spoken fluently by someone else. He understood its power, acknowledged its elegance, and was under no illusions about his own limitations within it. But he understood certain things. He understood enough to know that the murder of Victor Ashworth was not, at its heart, a crime of passion or impulse or opportunity. It was a calculated crime, precise, engineered. And its central mechanism, the prediction of which card a man would hold, was not, as it had first appeared, a matter of beating the odds. It was a matter of removing them. He wrote this down. The killer did not gamble. The killer eliminated the gamble. This was the crucial distinction. A gambler accepts uncertainty and plays within it. What had been done to Victor Ashworth was the opposite. It was the removal of uncertainty from a situation that appeared to any observer to be governed entirely by chance. How had this been achieved? Poirot drew 3 columns on a sheet of paper. He labelled them knowledge, materials, method, under knowledge. Someone knew Ashworth's habit of retaining picture cards. This knowledge was available to anyone who had played cards with him or spoken at length with someone who had. It was not secret knowledge. It was simply specific, the kind of specific that required proximity, or the right conversation with the right person. Under materials, aconitine, derived from monkshood, a plant that grew, Poirot recalled, in gardens throughout England, and whose alkaloids had been known to poisoners since antiquity. Extracting a usable compound required knowledge, equipment, and time. Alternatively, and Poirot considered this carefully, it could be obtained from someone who already had it. A chemist, a pharmacist, someone with access to a laboratory, or to the kind of private supply that certain people maintained and never discussed. Under method, the card manipulation, the false shuffle, the controlled deal, skills that took years to develop and that could not be improvised on an evening's notice. Whoever had dealt the King of Diamonds to Ashworth's hand had practiced this, had, at some point, decided to become very good at it. He looked at the 3 columns. Then he drew lines between them. Knowledge connected to all 3 men, Fothergill, Ashby, and Harlow. Each had roots, however different, to understanding Ashworth's habits. Materials connected most directly to Fothergill through the chemical company, but also, and here Poirot paused, to Ashby. Insurance underwriters, in the course of assessing industrial policies, occasionally developed a working familiarity with substances that could cause harm. It was part of the job, understanding what could go wrong, what could kill, what the liability might be. Ashby had underwritten industrial accounts for 15 years. He was a man who knew, in professional detail, exactly how dangerous various compounds were. Method connected to Harlow. Clearly, obviously, demonstrably. With 3 requirements, 3 men, 1 line each, unless Poirot sat back, unless the lines crossed somewhere, unless one man had more than one of these things, had over time assembled not just a motive, but a complete capability. The knowledge, the materials, and the method, all in one person. He thought about this for a long time. At 10 o'clock, Graves arrived. He came without telephoning first, which was slightly irregular, and he came with an expression that Poirot recognized, the expression of a man who has found something and is uncertain whether it makes things clearer or more complicated. He sat down, accepted coffee, and opened a folder on his knee. "Harlow," he said. "Yes?" "We found his card." Graves looked up. Not a playing card, his record, the one that doesn't appear in the standard files. He paused. "Before the import business, before the war even, Dennis Harlow spent 18 months between 1935 and 1937 working as a stage magician." Poirot was very still. "A professional one," Graves continued. "Small theatres, private engagements. He used a different name, Harold Dennis apparently. We found it through a theatrical agency that's still operating in Soho. Their records go back to 1930. He closed the folder. Card manipulation was, according to the agency's notes, his primary act. The room was quiet for a moment. "So," Graves said, "he can deal. He's been able to deal at a professional level for 20 years. "Yes," Poirot said, "and the debt to Ashworth gives him motive." And he arranged the game and selected the players. Graves set the folder on the table. "Poirot, It has to be Harlow." Poirot looked at him. "Tell me," he said, "what you know about Harlow's connection to aconitine." Graves paused. Nothing direct, not yet. And his knowledge of Ashworth's card-playing habits? Had he played with Ashworth before this game? We haven't established that. "No," Poirot said, "we have not." He stood and moved to his window. The same window he had stood at the previous evening, watching the rain. And the rain was still there, lighter now, but persistent. "The magician's background is significant, I do not dismiss it. But consider, Inspector, a man who was a professional card handler in 1935 and then very carefully buried that fact under a new name and a new career. Is that a man who would then use those skills in a murder investigation in a room where he is the only dealer? Desperate men make desperate mistakes, yes. But Harlow is not desperate in that way. He is careful. He has been careful for 20 years. Poirot turned. Unless he was counting on something. What? On the fact that his past would remain buried? Poirot paused, which it nearly did. Graves looked at him for a moment. "You're saying it could still be him." "I'm saying it could still be him," Poirot agreed. "I'm also saying there is something else. Something that has been troubling me since yesterday afternoon, and which I have not yet fully resolved." He returned to his desk and looked at his 3 columns. "The card was prepared in advance. Agreed?" "Yes. The laboratory confirmed the poison was applied before the game. The compound had partially dried into the card's surface, hours before, at minimum. Hours before," Poirot repeated. "So the card was treated and placed in the deck, and the deck was then, what? Kept somewhere, brought to the club by someone, substituted for the club's own deck during the game." Graves opened his mouth, then closed it. "We assumed," he said slowly, "that it was the club's deck." "As did I," Poirot said, "last night and this morning, and until approximately 20 minutes ago." He sat down. "The Craven Club uses its own playing cards. Standard practice in private clubs. Cards are kept at the premises, replaced regularly, stored in a cabinet in the card room. I telephoned the club secretary this morning at 9 o'clock. He let the pause develop. "The cabinet," he said, "is not locked." Graves straightened slightly. "Anyone with access to the club could have handled those cards," Poirot continued. "But more importantly, the deck used last night was taken from the cabinet by the night steward approximately 40 minutes before the game began and placed on the table in readiness. During those 40 minutes, the card room was, according to the steward, empty." He paused. "Or it should have been." "Should have been?" "The steward is 67 years old, and by his own admission, does not see well in low light. He placed the deck on the table, left the room, and did not return until after the game began." Poirot looked at Graves steadily. 40 minutes, a room with a deck of cards on the table, and no reliable witness to who entered or did not enter. Graves was quiet for a moment, working through it. "So the killer didn't need to bring a prepared deck," he said. "They could have prepared the card in advance, treated it, he kept it on their person, and then substituted it into the club's deck during those 40 minutes. "Yes," Poirot said, "which changes the question of access considerably. Harlow, as a club member, could have done this, but so could Fothergill. And Ashby, though not a member himself, arrived at the club early. The steward confirmed he was in the building at least 30 minutes before the game began, on the grounds that he had come to use the library." "The library," Graves said flatly. "The library," Poirot confirmed, with a faint expression that was not quite a smile. "Which is separated from the card room by a single corridor and an unlocked door." Graves picked up his folder and then set it down again, which was the gesture of a man recalibrating. So any of the three could have placed the card, he said. Any of the three, Poirot agreed. Which returns us to the question of who prepared it. And that question returns us to our 3 columns. He looked at his paper. The 3 columns, the lines between them. One man who has all 3, or 2 men who share them. You think there were 2 of them? I think, Poirot said carefully, that it is possible. And I think there is one conversation I have not yet had that may tell me whether it is more than possible. With whom? Poirot looked at his columns again. At the line that connected knowledge and materials, the line that ran thin but persistent toward the name he had been circling since Friday morning without quite landing on it. With Raymond Ashby, he said. I think it is time I spoke properly with the insurance man. The revelation. The meeting was arranged for Sunday morning. Poirot had requested it through Graves, which gave it a formality that a private approach would not have carried. And formality, Poirot had found, had a particular effect on certain kinds of people. It made them careful. And careful people, paradoxically, often revealed more than careless ones, because their carefulness had edges, and edges could be seen. Ashby arrived at Scotland Yard at 11 o'clock precisely. He was dressed as he had been at the card game. Dark suit, no tie-pin, shoes polished to a quiet shine. And he sat down across from Poirot and Graves with the composed expression of a man who has decided in advance how this conversation will go. Poirot found this interesting. Most innocent people, in Poirot's experience, who did not decide in advance how conversations with the police would go. They simply had them. It was guilty people, or people with something adjacent to guilt, who prepared. "Thank you for coming, Monsieur Ashby," Poirot said pleasantly. "Of course," Ashby said. "I want to help however I can. Victor's death, it's a terrible thing." "You were acquainted with Monsieur Ashworth for some years?" "Through business, yes. He was a client." "A client you visited at home on 3 occasions in the past 18 months. Something moved behind Ashby's eyes. Not alarm, not quite, but a recalibration. A man adjusting his position slightly on uncertain ground. "Client reviews," he said. "Some clients prefer a personal approach." "Indeed," Poirot said. "And what was discussed at these reviews?" "The usual things, policy terms, beneficiary arrangements. His health. Insurers take an interest in the health of their clients, naturally." "His health," Poirot repeated. "And was his health a cause for concern?" A pause, brief, controlled, but present. "He was 61, Ashby said. "We review regularly." "Of course." Poirot folded his hands on the table. "Monsieur Ashby, I would like to ask you something directly, and I would like you to consider your answer carefully before you give it. Not because I wish to trap you, I do not operate in that manner, but because I think the truth, in this case, is considerably less dangerous to you than the alternative." Ashby looked at him. His expression had not changed, but the quality of his stillness had become the stillness of a man listening very hard. "What did Victor Ashworth know about you?" Poirot asked, and the silence that followed lasted perhaps 8 seconds. Then Ashby looked at the table, and something in his face shifted. Not collapsed, not crumbled, but settled, like a structure that has been under strain and has finally been given permission to rest. "He knew about the Alderton account," he said. "It came out in pieces, the way these things do when a man has been holding them for a long time, not in order, not always clearly, but with the particular relief of someone finally setting down something heavy. The Alderton account was a shipping company, insured through Ashby's firm for a substantial sum against losses at sea. In 1949, a vessel, the Marta Celeste, registered in Gibraltar, had sunk in the Bay of Biscay with a cargo declared to be industrial textiles. The claim had been paid £42,000. The investigation had been, in Ashby's own words, adequate. It had not been thorough. "I signed off on it," Ashby said. "The evidence was there were questions I didn't pursue, questions I should have pursued." He looked at his hands. The cargo wasn't textiles, or not entirely. There were things on that ship that shouldn't have been there, and people who needed the claim paid quickly and quietly, and He stopped. "I was well compensated for my signature." "Compensated by whom?" Graves asked. Ashby looked up. "By the people who needed the claim paid." "Harlow," Poirot said quietly. Ashby's expression confirmed it without words. "Harlow Trading was the named importer on the original cargo documents," Poirot said. He had suspected this since Friday, had not been certain until this moment. He and Monsieur Ashworth discovered this. During one of his Foreign Office contacts, he still had people, even after he retired. Someone showed him something or told him something, and he made the connection. He came to me 18 months ago. Ashby's voice was steady, but only just. He didn't go to the authorities. He wasn't that kind of man, or at least he said he wasn't. He said he wanted only to talk. But the conversations continued, Poirot said. 3 visits. He wanted money. Ashby looked up. Not large amounts, not ruinous, but regular. He said he called it a retainer, for his silence. A pause. I paid him, each time, and each time he said it would be the last, and each time it was not. The room was quiet. Did Harlow know that Ashworth had this information? Poirot asked. I told him, Ashby said. 6 months ago. I had to. Ashworth was becoming more demanding, and I needed help, or I thought I did. He pressed his lips together. Harlow said he would handle it. And you believed him? I didn't ask what he meant by it. Ashby's voice dropped slightly. I told myself it would be a conversation, a warning, something. But not this, Graves said. Not this, Ashby said. I want to be absolutely clear. I did not know what Harlow planned. I did not know about any poison. I did not know about the card. He looked at Poirot with an expression that was part desperation and part something that might have been genuine. I had no idea. Poirot looked at him for a long moment. No, he said at last. I do not think you did. Harlow was brought in on Sunday afternoon. He came without resistance, which Poirot found, in retrospect, entirely characteristic of the man. He had the composure of someone who had anticipated this moment and had decided that composure was his best remaining asset. He sat in the same chair Ashby had occupied and looked at Poirot with the open, agreeable face that had made so many people trust him so easily for so many years. Monsieur Harlow, Poirot said. Monsieur Poirot, Harlow said, almost pleasantly. I would like to tell you what I know, Poirot said, and you may correct me where I am wrong. Harlow said nothing, which was as close to consent as he was likely to offer. You arranged the poker game, Poirot began. You selected the players. This was not coincidence. Each player served a purpose. Fothergill was window dressing, a familiar face to make the evening seem ordinary. And Ashby was your partner in this, not in the murder, as he has told us and as I believe, but in the problem that made the murder necessary. And Ashworth was the target. Harlow's expression did not change. You knew Ashworth's habits at the card table. You had done your research, spoken to people who had played with him, learned that he retained his picture cards as a matter of near instinct. You were a professional card handler for 18 months in the 1930s. Harold Dennis, I believe, was the name. and you have never lost the skill, only the public acknowledgement of it. A very slight movement at the corner of Harlow's mouth. Not a smile, an acknowledgement. You obtained aconitine, Poirot continued. This required some work. It is not easily available. But you are a man who imports goods from the continent, who has connections in several countries, who has moved things across borders before that were not what they appeared to be. An additional item, small, carefully packaged, this was not beyond your capacity. He paused. You treated the King of Diamonds, the upper right corner, where a man holds a card between thumb and forefinger, as Ashworth always did with his picture cards. You applied the compound carefully, used a pin to ensure penetration through the card's lacquered surface. Then you carried the card to the Craven Club on Thursday evening, arrived early, and during the 40 minutes when the card room was empty and unwatched, you substituted your prepared card for the corresponding card in the club's own deck. Harlow was very still. Then you sat down and dealt, Poirot said. And because you are very, very good at what you do, what you used to do professionally, you dealt the King of Diamonds to Ashworth's hand. A false shuffle to keep the card in position. A controlled deal to place it correctly. And Ashworth, reliable as he had always been, picked it up and held it exactly where you knew he would. The room was silent. You did not gamble, Poirot said. That is what I find most, I will not say admirable, that is not the word, most remarkable about this. You are a man who arranged other men's deaths the way other men arrange business meetings. You removed every variable. You left nothing to chance. In a game built entirely on chance, you eliminated it. Harlow looked at him for a moment. Then he said quietly, You can't prove the card handling. No, Poirot agreed, not directly. There are no witnesses to a false shuffle. A false shuffle, by definition, looks like a real one. That particular thread I cannot tie. He paused, but I do not need to. I can prove the substitution. Your fingerprints, partial but present, are on the underside of the card cabinet in the card room. You opened it. The steward did not. No other member of the club entered the card room that evening before the game began. He folded his hands. I can prove the aconitine was sourced through a contact in Antwerp with whom your firm has conducted business since 1948. I can prove the debt and the motive. I can prove that you arranged this evening specifically to create this opportunity. He looked at Harlow steadily. The card handling, that I will leave to the jury to infer. Something shifted in Harlow's face. Very slightly, and the composure remained, but something beneath it, some load-bearing element, had given way. £12,000, Poirot said almost gently, and the other matter, the Martyr Celeste, which Ashworth knew about and which, had he decided to take it somewhere other than Ashby's wallet, would have ended rather more than your import business. He paused. You did not do this for £12,000, Monsieur Harlow. You did it because Ashworth had become a threat you could not manage any other way. Harlow said nothing for a long time. Then he would never have stopped. No, Poirot said quietly. I do not think he would have. So, Poirot said. He looked at Harlow without anger, without satisfaction, with the particular expression he sometimes wore at the end of these things. Not quite sorrow, not quite weariness, but something in the neighborhood of both. You solved the problem with considerable intelligence and no conscience whatsoever. And here we are. Graves nodded to the constable at the door. Poirot sat for a while after Harlow was taken out. Graves brought him tea, which was not tisane, but which Poirot accepted without comment, because some moments called for accommodation rather than preference. "Ashby," Graves said, sitting down across from him. "What happens to him?" "That," Poirot said, "is a question for lawyers and prosecutors, not for me. He participated in fraud. He paid blackmail. He told Harlow about Ashworth's knowledge, which set this in motion." He paused. "Whether he could have known what Harlow would do, that is a matter for others to decide." "And Fothergill?" "Fothergill knew nothing. He is a foolish man with bad investments and a signet ring he turns when he is nervous. He was present at a murder without knowing it, which is, as he will discover when the newspapers get hold of this, quite enough trouble for one lifetime." Graves was quiet for a moment. "You made a mistake," he said, "earlier in the case about Ashworth's hands." "I did," Poirot said. He said it simply, without embarrassment, because it was true, and he had learned, over many years, that the truth was better acknowledged than avoided. "I spoke with more certainty than the evidence warranted. It did not affect the outcome, but it could have if I had built too much upon it. This is the danger of a mind like mine, Inspector. It moves quickly. Sometimes it arrives at a destination before it has properly examined the route." "And yet here we are," Graves said with a slight smile. "And yet here we are," Poirot agreed. He drank his tea. It was too strong and not sweet enough, and he said nothing about this either. Outside, London was doing what London did, moving, indifferent, vast, entirely unaware that in a small room in Scotland Yard, the particular and patient machinery of justice had completed one more turn. Somewhere, a bus was running late. Somewhere, a shop front was being swept. Somewhere, in a flat in Mayfair, the belongings of Victor Ashworth were waiting to be catalogued by people who had never met him. And somewhere, this was the thought that stayed with Poirot as he set down his cup and reached for his coat. Somewhere in a cardboard box in an evidence room, the King of Diamonds lay face up in a sealed envelope, waiting to be examined by people who would measure and photograph and document it with great thoroughness and never quite understand what it represented. Not just a murder weapon, not just a card. A proof, Poirot thought. A proof that in a world that liked to believe in luck, that liked to sit at tables and shuffle decks and tell itself that chance was the great equalizer, there were men who refused to leave anything to chance at all. He buttoned his coat. The little grey cells, he thought, had done their work. He went out into the cold.